I'm not going to switch on my camera because my Wi-Fi is always being a bit bad. But yeah, if you can just like ask questions at any point when we're going to go through this. Okay. Yeah, so we're basically going to be talking about anti-governmental movements in the developing world. The way this workshop is going to go is I'll go through four examples of specific anti-governmental movements that happened in Asia, and then I'll go through a few similarities between these movements, and then kind of discuss a few things that are important for debates, maybe link it back to a few motions that were there recently. And then finally, we'll also talk about certain anti-governmental movements in the Sahel region, which don't really take democratic form, but take more coup, more militaristic form, and kind of like try to differentiate that as well, because that is also a phenomenon that is happening. Okay, so let's go through a few examples of what kind of movements these look like. So I'll basically go through four examples in the developing world of specific countries in which anti-governmental movements have happened. Okay, the first one is the Bangladesh July revolutions. So this happened 2 years ago in July, where it was primarily a student-led social movement that happened where there was mass protests and as well as mass violence, not only from the government side, but also from the protester side. A few key things to think about with regards to this social movement. It primarily happened as a response to the lack of economic growth that happened in Bangladesh. The specific catalyst were these things called the civil service quotas, which were there within the civil service carried out by the government. These quotas said that majority of the civil service should be, and the jobs in the civil service should be given to people who served in the war that was fought for independence from Pakistan. So it was primarily people who were relatives of the people who fought for the war, who were basically serving in the civil service. As a result, majority of the young, educated population didn't really have access to civil service jobs. So even though Bangladesh had probably one of the fastest growing economies in South Asia and in most of Asia, this economic growth was basically not trickling down to the educated youth population. It was primarily economic growth that was driven by the growth in the textile sector and more tertiary sectors, and not necessarily educated sectors like the service sector, like the civil service, etc. So as a result, there was very, very like deep grievances among the youth educated population, and the fact that they had no opportunity to even to get jobs in the civil service meant these grievances basically were translated into protest and a social movement. It started off as massive protests and like massive student protests that initially led to like large amount of violence and repression from the government. So the first response was police officers and like armed forces being deployed, and there was tensions and like shootings that took place. And in response to this, there was even more people who came to the streets, and there was like a mass gathering of people in Dhaka in the central city, and this basically led to like mob violence, and there was attacks on governmental buildings, attacks on state infrastructure, attacks on police stations, etc., to the point where the military couldn't basically control the violence that were taking place. And the prime minister, one of the longest serving prime ministers in the whole of Asia, she left and she had to flee the country, and the government was basically toppled. This is the process in which it happened. So it was violence that scared away the government and led to the toppling of the government, because they realized that if they didn't resign or leave the country, they would probably be killed or at least being taken to the street and like just being part of the mob violence and the outcomes of that. Afterwards, there was a lot of discussions among the leadership of the social movement, so primarily student leadership, in coalition with some of the newer political parties to about the next steps that were to be done after these protests were basically cooling. The result was multiple discussions and very little agreement between these different parties. However, finally, there was an interim government that was created under Muhammad Yunus, who was a Nobel Peace Laureate, very, very, very respected within Bangladeshi society until the 2026 election. The biggest problem currently facing Bangladesh right now is reinstating law and order, because there is still a risk of mob violence like being like ignited every time something goes wrong. And this is something to think about when it comes to social movements like this, and thinking about in terms of debating, thinking or in terms of like why tipping points can be proven in like how you're talking about social change, etc. And even if you like can prove why a government can be toppled, can you really prove whether the the government that is going to succeed can be stable and can actually carry out policies and carry out like constitutional changes, etc. Because this is currently a struggle that Bangladesh is facing because it is on a knife's edge. It is very unclear whether the institutional structures of law and order, the court system, the armed forces, the police forces, etc., can actually maintain civil law and stability in the country, because every time something gets prolonged, every time the people on the ground feel like the government is not doing something, there is a risk that mob violence will come into play again. I will talk about more specifics on like how this would be related to the debate later, but this is just a general TLDR on what the situation in Bangladesh looks right now. I think the big questions to think about here with regards to debating motions is what kind of government will be instated in the next scenario. How will you coordinate between the different groups? Who should be the leader? Whether there should be centralized leadership with regards to student movements and social movements, etc. Okay, any specific questions on the Bangladesh revolution? If not, we can move on. I'll give you guys like a minute if you have any questions. Okay, I'm gonna assume there is no questions. Okay, so a very similar situation happened in Nepal. However, this was last year. These protests were called the Gen Z protests, and these started happening in the August and September of last year. Very similar story to Bangladesh, a lack of economic development, but here it was primarily a lack of economic development for the rural majority in Nepal that kind of flared up these protests. A few important key things to remember with regards to these protests is that social media played an incredibly important role to the point where Western media and Western news channels, for the first few days of the protests, primarily reported on these protests as in response to the social media bans that were carried out by the government without really engaging with the actual structural reasons as to why the protests happened. The big reason was the large degree of inequality that was quite representative within the society and that was highlighted by social media. What this looked like was the elites and the elites' children were flaunting their wealth on social media, like on TikTok. So they would post pictures on their helicopters, they would post pictures on their like in their mansions, driving their really bougie cars, going out and partying, going to like Dubai, going to Singapore, and like just like all over social media, they were plastering and like flaunting their wealth and just showcasing how rich they were. In contrast, social media was also highlighting large degrees of like economic poverty that was happening in the rural areas of the country. So this looked like like some degree of like starvation that was happening with the people, food insecurity, the fact that infrastructure was crippling and crumbling, and the government was basically ignoring this, and the fact that these two were side by side was the reason why these grievances came to the forefront. Um, the way this protest looked like was it was shared on social media to come together in Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal, and to like basically protest against the government. And this initially started off as a small protest, small in like in the grand scheme of things, and based on compared to what it looked like at the end. But this looks like about 2-3 thousand people came to Kathmandu and started protesting. As in the case before, the first governmental response was repression. So they sent the police to control the protest. There was a shooting that happened, and this shooting was a catalyst to kind of blow over the grievances of the people, where they had enough of the government, they had enough of the elites, and like thousands and thousands of people in droves came out to the street and basically started attacking every single state infrastructure that was they could find. So this picture I've shared is basically the parliament, and they burned down the parliament and large swaths of like majority of the state infrastructure of the biggest politicians. One of the biggest kind of like pictures and videos that went viral of these protests were the past prime minister and his wife, who were who was like kind of who had a big embezzlement and corruption case, were basically dragged out onto the street and beaten by thousands of people and basically taken away by the protesters to like jail and like just given like mob justice. And the few important things to remember with regards to these protests for debating sake is how in Nepal there were three major parties who were controlling the country since independence. And after these protests, there was lack of legitimacy for these political parties to come into power again. Because these parties were the ones who controlled the government for the 70 odd years they've been independent, and they've been continuously failing the majority of the rural population and the middle class, and basically emboldening and creating greater wealth for the richest of the richest. And now it looks like newer political parties were led by younger people, younger politicians, and the younger generation are coming into the forefront of the political scene in Nepal. One of the biggest demands were institutional reform, which look like instating constitutional limits for the politicians, like the head of state, constitutional limits on ministers, different educational limits on different educational standards on politicians. So it's kind of a move towards technocracy where they felt like the politicians were really stupid people who were just rich and wealthy businessmen. They didn't really have the capacity or the knowledge to actually run a country well. So there's a movement towards technocracy. Another like interesting fact to remember about how important social media was the vote for the interim leader happened on a Discord forum. So it was a Discord forum called Youth Against the Elites. And it was in this Discord forum that people voted for who they wanted to be the next leader of the country. And kind of reflects how when young people take over means of democracy and means of political systems, the role of social media becomes incredibly important. And where like close to 15,000 people voted on this Discord forum, and it was broadcasted on news media, broadcasted on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. And the person who got the most votes on this Discord forum ended up becoming the interim leader of the country. And it's kind of a reflection of how newer generation protests and social movements are characterized by the increasing importance of social media and the role social media plays in how democracy is being translated on the ground. So it's an interesting fact to remember when you talk about like social media motions, social media, and social movements, how important social media is for the developing world and how the people in the developing world interact with democracy via social media. Yeah, so that's kind of a TLDR about the protests in Nepal. Any questions there? Okay. Yeah. Next one is the protests in Indonesia. So uh, the case here is less so similar to Bangladesh and Nepal, where the government is still in control of the country, and it didn't lead to the government overhaul or the massive institutional changes or the starting of the massive institutional changes like it did in the last two cases. Um, um, but there are like certain similarities that you can derive from the case of Indonesia as well. It was characterized by strong sentiments against corruption and strong sentiments against against the lack of fair economic development that was taking place. So the big catalyst in Indonesia was um, the new policies that were being carried out by the government that benefited the elite. So this looked like giving uh, giving allowances to the ministers of parliament. These looked like housing allowances that were more than 10 times the minimum wage of Jakarta, which was the capital, which is the capital of Indonesia. These housing allowances and other allowances for ministers of parliament and ministers who were running different ministries were simultaneously coupled with large stimulus policies. These stimulus policies look like gutting healthcare, gutting education, gutting infrastructure development. So there was a reduction in the civil service and spending for the welfare state that actually benefited people. And this was seen as elite entrenchment and helping the elites who were just becoming richer and more powerful, while the poorest and the middle class who needed welfare, who needed access to infrastructure, who needed access to education and healthcare were just simply being ignored by the government. Obviously, these led to violent protests, and in the other cases, the first response of the government was repression. This looked like a military car being driven into protesters, where a protester died, protesters being shot at, etc. However, this didn't lead to the mass mob violence that took over the whole country like it looked like in Nepal and Bangladesh. even though there were certain situations where arsonists would go and burn state infrastructure and state buildings. Indonesia is a country where I think there's a much stronger military control by the government, and the military and the armed forces were able to quell large amounts of the protests and kind of control the situation on the ground and reduce some degree of the instability. However, the government did go on to reverse the allowances that were given to MPs. They also made promises to reinstate certain spending for welfare, even though it might not have been the same amount or same degree as it was before. So I think a thing to remember about Indonesia that is different from Bangladesh and Nepal is the degree to which the government has control over the military. And when the government has more control, more stringent control over the military, how it can actually quell protests, even though there is a risk of instability, a risk of mob violence that happens. So you kind of like push back very hard against the people, and then people become more scared to actually come out and continue protesting, especially when they see mass violence and mass repression by a very, very strong state apparatus, a very, very strong military apparatus being carried out against the people who are protesting. So the current situation in Indonesia is the current government, the government is still continuing the control, and there's some degree of stability that has been reached, and there's some degree of protest that still continues, but there's a more of an impasse that is there compared to the other cases where there was a massive overhaul of the government. Okay. The final example I would want to talk about is Sri Lanka and the Argalia protests that took place in 2022. The reason why I want to talk about this example is this is more of a situation that has progressed over time, and it's been about 3 to 4 years since these protests. And this is an example to think about in which how these protests actually transfer and transform into actual political change. So the Aragole protests were primarily a protest movement that was calling for systematic change within the government system. So Sri Lanka is a country that has had a very, very strong political dynasty since the early 2000s. That was the Rajapaksa dynasty. And this is a political family that have basically been in control of the country since the early 2000s. They've been the president, the minister and secretary of defense, the president again, multiple different ministries, and multiple members of the family running different parts of the country. And in 2022, the president was also Rajapaksa, and there was multiple economic issues that were the catalysts for this protest movement. So what basically happened is, and what basically Sri Lanka looks like is Sri Lanka is a country that is quite dependent on tourism and quite dependent on certain amount of exports like textiles and tea, etc. And following the COVID pandemic and other issues that existed, like a terrorist attack that happened in 2019, large amounts of tourism stopped coming into the country because the world basically halted. And as a result, the biggest source of foreign income basically stopped. And there was a foreign reserve shortage that happened in the country, and the government was rejecting any IMF deal, IMF negotiation to actually discuss debt restructuring and debt relief, etc. Where it came to a point where the government did not have reserves to pay for imports. And what this meant was that there were basically in early 2022, the government ran out of money. And so the government didn't have enough money to spend on fuel. They didn't have enough money to spend on basic food imports. They didn't have enough money to spend on other imports that were important for the economy, etc. And basically, the country came to a halt. There were food queues, there was gas queues, there were oil queues, and the country could not run. And in front of this building called the Presidential Secretariat, there was a protest that gathered that went on for more than 100 days. And this basically led to a mass, more than maybe 500,000 people coming in to the capital city and basically overthrowing the government in a very peaceful way without really much, like there was some violence, but there wasn't violence as much to the degrees of Bangladesh and Nepal. And the president stepped down and fled, and the government resigned. This happened in September of 2022. Afterwards, there was an interim government. However, this interim government was also aligned with the previous regime, so there was kind of a stalling of the democratic process for around 2 years. However, in 2024, a political outside a political party that had links to this social movement for the first time in 75 years, won the presidency and the parliamentary election and came into power. And this political party was a socialist political party that was not aligned to the two main political parties who've been running the country for the last 75 years and now is running the country, has been making progress with regards to dealing with corruption, reducing elitism, addressing grievances, and actually having social policies that are helpful for people on the ground. And that's basically how this social movement translated into actual political change, actual legislative change, and actually having some degree of political mobilization that took place in the country. So this is kind of a different situation from the other three cases because there's been a few years that have passed. There's been time given for the social movement to actually kind of mature, actually translate into political change, and actually kind of connect with the political parties and become an actual movement that can actually create change. Okay, so these are the kind of four examples that I want to talk about. Any questions at this point about the specific cases we've discussed, or like any
Uh,
like kind of concerns or
just out of
anything?
curiosity,
Yeah.
why did the government not make any deals or negotiations with the IMF?
Can you say that one more time?
So why did the Sri Lankan government not make any deals or like successfully complete any negotiations with the IMF?
Yeah, so there's multiple reasons for this. I think one is that this government is like embroiled in corruption and very like large amounts of elitism. Obviously, IMF deals are conditional that would push to some degree of like opening up anti-corruption measures. In addition to that, Sri Lanka is a country with a lot of like state ownership. When it looks like state ownership in electricity, state ownership in water, state ownership of ports, of yeah, ports, etc. And obviously, there is a strong grassroots level push against liberalization and privatization of these entities. So there is also like a push from the ground against the IMF conditions that push towards liberalization and privatization. So there was also a push away from that on the ground. So there is like there were political incentives for the government to not do debt restructuring and not do debt relief from the IMF because these IMF conditions might be going against the political incentives of the party that was running. So they tried to use more local means of like reducing imports, or increasing import tariffs so people become more self-resilient, etc. But obviously, Sri Lanka is a small country, cannot become import resilient, and this just led to like food shortages and problems like that. So the current government is doing the IMF deal and doing that restructuring with the help of the IMF. But that is the primary reason as to why they didn't want to do that. Okay, let's go into the next slide. Okay, so a few similarities. I'm not going to spend too much time here because this is just very like simple recap of the examples that we discussed. Okay, so I mean, the first thing is usually large degree of social movements uh, primarily happen because of some degree of economic strife. And it is usually this grievance that people blame the government for because most governments come into power by saying that they're going to do economic change, they're going to help the people on the ground, they're going to provide welfare, they're going to deal with poverty, they're going to create employment. These are the large swatch of like promises most governments, even in the developed world, make. It is when these promises fail, it is when these promises aren't given that leads to economic strife that hurts people, do protests and social movements actually begin. And obviously, the thing to think about is what part of the population is hurt by this economic strife. In the case of Bangladesh, in the case of Nepal, it was educated youth, it was the middle class who were educated, who was hurt most by the economic strife because there were no economic opportunities for these people. Whereas the tertiary sector, where was less educated people, blue collar workers, actually had opportunities and economic growth was actually helpful for them when it looked like things like agriculture and textiles actually increasing in growth, etc. Whereas in the cases of Indonesia, it was more the rural people, more poorer people who actually had the economic problems that were enlarged by the government decision making. So it's important to think about where exactly in the population and who exactly is being hurt. And that kind of translate into how the protest movement actually happened, how they organize, what their demands actually look like, etc. The second, like very, very big similarity is, of course, an anti-corruption sentiment. And this is obviously a big sentiment that is across the global south and now even to the global north, right? Because I think the common trajectory of a lot of developing countries is that they have very comparatively weak institutions. And when they have weak institutions, there is weak accountability. There is weak separation of power between the legislature, executive, and the court system, right? And as a result, there is very little capacity to ensure accountability, ensure anti-corruption, ensure independence of different bodies within the government. And so corruption can become endemic in a lot of developing countries. And this corruption obviously takes money away from the poorest, right? It does in the form of bribes, it does in the form of commissions, it does in the form of infrastructure being prolonged and not actually being made while politicians siphon off money away from the people. And as a result, governments ensure control and riches, while the people suffer and people actually do not benefit from taxation and do not benefit from welfare spending. Um, the final thing to think about is violence, not only from the state, but also against the state, because violence in majority of these social movements is a two-way process. It is like people don't just sit around and wait while they're repressed. People fight back. People take violence and into their own hands. And we can talk about this later in the next slide, but it's an important feature across majority of the developing countries and protest movements that happen in these developing countries that violence is a significant part of the picture. It is a significant part of the story in which these protests happen, how they translate, how they reach a tipping point, how they push governments actually to change their behavior and take into considerations the grievances on the ground. Okay, let's go and talk about what to remember for debates. The first thing to think about in debates with regards to social movements when it comes to the developing world is that none of these social movements are a monolith. So it is very easy to be reductive in how you think about these social movements, to think that it is all the same people. They're all coming together like this utopian system of social movements where there are no differences, there are no grievances within the social movement. They're all coming together for this like holier than thou goal of like anti-corruption, governmental change, democracy. But it's not really the case when you look at it on the ground, when you kind of break down the surface level analysis you have on social movements. Most of these social movements are incredibly fragmented. Most of the people who are fighting for rights have completely different goals and they have completely different conceptions of how they can achieve these goals. So there are multiple differences that actually are on the ground, right? When you look at the developing world. One, the people are from different economic backgrounds. It is very difficult to put the person from the middle class with a service job or a person from the middle class with a university degree with a rural farmer. They have multiple differences in their economic standards, in how much capital they have, in their economic aspirations and dreams, etc., how they kind of conceptualize themselves as a citizen of these countries. There's also differences like ethnicity. There's also differences like religion. And there are, in many cases, developing countries are not like homogeneous. There are ethnic minorities that exist that also their own grievances are an important factor when it comes to these social movements. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, there was a large Tamil minority that played an important role in the social movement in the Aragalaya because they had grievances that were still around from the civil war because of missing people, missing family members, land redistribution, things like that that haven't been done by the government, even though they promised this during peacetime. In Bangladesh, there is a lot of grievances by the Hindu minority that violence is being taken place by the student movement, who is primarily Muslim students, etc. So ethnic differences and religious differences are an important factor of fragmentation to think about when you look at these social movements. And the reason why it's important to think about social movements in a very nuanced way is because this also impacts the way in which the social movement manifests in the long term, right? Because in the short term, they have a big enemy. May it be the government, may it be the military, may it be the corrupt politician they're attacking. But this big enemy is not going to be there for all the time, right? After you push them out of power, after you kick them out and you take control of the government, you don't have the same unifying narratives. You don't have the same unifying figure to fight against. And that is when these fragmentations come into play. That is when these differences come in between people to actually make consensus and make decisions. Like if you look at the case of Bangladesh, there is still large degree of differences on the ground on how to go forward, who to lead, who to actually look towards to make decisions, how to deal with the structural problems. Because some people might think that violence and mob violence is the answer because it works. It worked to kick out the prime minister. It worked to fight against repression. While other people might think that violence is not sustainable, that the solution is legislation, the solution is non-violence, the solution is democracy, the solution is civil participation. And obviously, these two things cannot coexist, right? When there is violence, democracy erodes. When there is violence, civil participation becomes scarce because people are less willing to come out and participate because they are worried that violence might affect them as well. So there are these differences that really are important to think about because they help us understand how the future of these social movements would actually look like, how they actually translate into change. Um, the second thing to think about for the debates is that the developing world does not conceptualize democracy in the same terms that the West does. And obviously, this is why the Western imposition of democracy in places like Afghanistan don't really work because it is a very, very elitist Western conception, right? Like when student protesters are fighting on the ground for rights, they aren't fighting with the abstract conception that you would have in the West for democracy or like US separation of power or the sovereignty of the person or sovereignty of the voter. They're fighting for much more tangible things. They're fighting for a government that actually cares about them. They're fighting for a government that will give them jobs. They're fighting for a government that spends welfare without being corrupt, without siphoning money away. They're fighting for more things that they can touch. Like where you have this like interesting saying that says you can't eat democracy, you can't eat freedom of expression, where you can like these people are fighting for much more tangible things, where as kind of approaching debates in a very Western-centric democracy conception probably is not helpful and is quite reductive when you kind of the way you conceptualize how democracy works on the ground in a lot of developing countries. And obviously, there is sometimes also aversions to Western democracy because you have the history of colonialism. You have the anti-Western sentiment, which is quite prevalent in these countries because of like neo-colonial conceptions of how people on the ground are fearful that the West will come and dominate them again. How you have media and social media narratives that push anti-democratic sentiments in a Western conception. So it's very different in how people on the ground conceptualize democracy. Like democracy is more about tangible change, more institutional change, more structural change that people can feel, people can see, and it is less so the principled fight for democracy that might be seen in the West as much right now. The next thing to think about is that most of these social movements do not have centralized leaders. And this is a very important thing about how these social movements materialize in the future. And obviously, this goes back into debates about like whether social movements should have a centralized leader, whether it's good to have centralized leadership, whether it's good to have decentralized leadership, etc. And obviously, developing countries are a very good example for movements like to think about movements that do not have centralized leadership because these are very grassroots level movements that start on the ground. It is not this one big leader who comes and tells people and directs them to go and fight. It is students, it is young people, it is farmers who go on the streets and start fighting. It's these people who are like on the ground, who are young, who talk about visceral emotions, who talk about what they feel and what their aspirations for the future are. And it is these people who fight for like the rights that they think are important for them. And it's very rare cases where you have a centralized leader that you can look for. And the reason why it is important to think about centralized leadership is how do you kind of moderate and how do you discuss with the political parties in the long term then? A big problem in Bangladesh right now is the fact that there is multiple different student leaders who have power centers, who have different conceptions of what the future of Bangladesh look like, who can't come into agreement. And so it might be a problem when it comes to centralized leadership. But equally, when you have a centralized leadership, maybe it is much easier to repress. Because when you take the leader down, it is much harder for you to continue the social movement. It is much harder for you to continue like fighting for the grievances that you think is important. Another thing to think about is how much more difficult it makes it to coordinate with political parties. Because when you don't have a centralized leader, who do you coordinate with? Who do you collaborate with? Who do you make compromises with? It is a bit unclear. So it might be important to appoint a centralized leader, vote for a leader like it happened in Nepal. Have these like informal leaders who you look up to, who can be a representative of the masses and be a representative of all these people and kind of coalesce all of their grievances and their thoughts, etc., and come together. So it's kind of important to think about how leadership works, how coordination works, how agreement works in the future. This also translates into how long-term democracy looks like for these countries, right? A big question in most of these debates, like, I mean, for example, round nine at Worlds is like when this round I judge that opposition, the question and the rebuttal opposition always say is, oh, okay, but there's protests, but this doesn't translate into actual democracy. It doesn't translate into actual political change in the long term. It fizzles out. It fizzles into violence. It fizzles into mob violence. So it's important to think about how social movements actively translate into political change. One way could be that the social movements, the youth groups, become political parties in the long run, like it's happening in Bangladesh. Maybe political parties um, use this awakening of the people and increase mobilization, increase participation in elections. Maybe they use the leadership of these social movements and integrate them into their own political body to showcase that they're actually listening to these political movements. They're listening to the social movement and its leaders. And maybe that is how they can win elections. But it also can be that people on the ground are just simply more politically aware now, that they are more willing to participate in protests. They're more willing to go to things like rallies. They're more willing to ask politicians questions and ask politicians and keep them accountable. And there is a big change that actually can happen. So it's important to think about like meeting a tipping point. How do you actually translate to change? What does democracy actually mean in the long term? What does democracy mean in the terms of elections, of civil participation, of political parties, etc.? Okay. Final thing I want to talk about here is the use of violence, because that is also a very important thing in most debates about social movements, whether violence is justified, whether violence is a normatively good thing, whether violence is legitimate, whether violence is necessary. And these are kind of questions that come up in these motions. So I think the first thing to say here is that there are multiple ways to justify violence in social movements and explain why it is legitimate, right? I mean, the first very intuitive explanation is to explain why when the state fails in protecting its rights and the state is actively repressing you in your attempt to fight for those rights, the state has bypassed their right for the monopoly of violence. And the only way you can defend yourself and the only way you can fight for your rights and your right to life, etc., is through violence. And that is when you fight back against the people who are shooting you, fight back against the politicians who are repressing you, fight back against the state apparatus that is pushing you down. And this is obviously a very grassroots conception and feeling that people have as well, right? That is why they attack state infrastructure, because they feel like these are symbols of oppression. They are symbols of a system of elitism that siphons money away from you and emboldens and enriches the rich. So that is why they attack buildings like the parliament, buildings like the presidential house, because they feel like those are the structures that signify the elitism, inequality, and the lack of rights that you have right now. Another way you can look at violence is that it is normatively a good thing because violence makes the government scared. Because, for example, when the people are fighting back, when the people are attacking you, when the people are hurting you, that is when you're scared enough to actually make change. Because peaceful protests did not work because you can ignore the people who are screaming at you. You can ignore and drown out their cries because you focus on the lobbyists, you focus on the rich, you focus on the elites, and they embolden you and they make you rich. So you don't need to care about them. Maybe elections don't work because elections, there's gerrymandering. Because election works on majority. Most poor people don't vote because they don't have time, because they have to work their jobs. Things like that, right? So the only time that makes people, only time politicians listen is when they're fearful of their lives, when they feel like they cannot not listen to you because they will die, or their way to protect themselves have been taken away. And this is obviously a way to explain as to why normatively it actually leads to change. It leads to the military becoming scared. It leads to the armed forces becoming scared, the police becoming scared, and actually listening to your grievances, and actually trying to change and make structural change that address those grievances, right? And obviously, that's a way you can explain the use of violence. The final thing here to say is that sometimes violence and violence in response to violence is just a natural outcome, because most people or some people aren't willing to get beaten down without a response. When you feel like everything is taking your rights away, when you feel like the society or the system that is meant to help you is actually hurting you, people aren't going to take it face down. They are naturally going to fight back because people have a natural inclination to be to protect themselves. They have an inclination for their self well-being, an inclination for their community, for their family. So they obviously will fight back and fight against the system that is oppressing them. So maybe that is a natural biological reaction. So as a result, it is legitimate because no one looks away while they're beaten. No one looks away and takes it while their rights are being taken away. So maybe another reason why it is legitimate, because it is natural, it is biological, and it is the innate response in response to violence that is being taken against you. So obviously, this was a lot of like random ramblings as well of my thoughts on what I think democracy and social movements in these countries look like. Obviously, if you have any questions on this specific slide, you're welcome to ask. I do realize I was quite long and there had a lot of different thoughts embedded in it. So if you have any like clarifications or questions on this, you can ask. I'll like give you guys like a minute and a half while I drink a sip of water. And tell me if it was confusing or it was like too complicated or if it not make sense. I'm happy to go through it again and kind of like simplify it if that helps. Any questions? I can't see the chat. I'm assuming there's no questions on the chat either. Okay, I'll take a breather while you guys think if you have any questions.
The main thing in the chat now is just people saying that it was clear.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so just to wrap up this part of it, um, so what has always helped me for social movements debates is to break the actor down to multiple different parts on where different groups of actors within the social movement who would become the most important, how they would fight for rights, how they would fight for change, and what the response to that attempt would actually look like by the rest of society. These are just questions I ask myself in every social movement debate because that kind of encapsulates the every single element of the social movement debate. How the society responds to it answers questions about things like backlash, things like how the moderate person responds, how the extremes of society responds, how fundraisers, companies, governments respond. How you fight for rights answers the question on the of tactics, whether tactics work, how much capital you need for tactics, what the trade-off when you do certain tactics actually look like. It answers questions about messaging and how you either need to have a unified, streamlined message, or you can have multiple different messages while also achieving all those different things that you're fighting for. Who is fighting or who you want to represent answers the question of what the goals of the social movement look like, who is the most vulnerable or the most important part of the social movement is, and who needs to be pushed to the forefront or the front in the first place. And it also answers the question of leadership, who takes charge, who takes the reins, who actually leads these groups and kind of takes them to the next step, etc. And that kind of is the are the main questions I ask myself when I debate social movements. Okay, the final slide is about coups in the Sahel. So these are also different type of anti-governmental movements. The reason why I didn't phrase this workshop as pro-democracy movements is because some of these movements are just not pro-democracy. Like even social movements we discussed before might not be explicitly pro-democracy, even though there are elements to it. There might be groups within it who aren't pro-democracy, but are more pragmatic, care more about tangible change within society, and care more about actually gaining like resources, gaining welfare, etc., even if they don't care about democracy as much. However, the coups in the Sahel are, I would say, in many cases, non-democratic, much more about addressing grievances using autocratic solutions or solutions that centralize power around the military or around specific dictators or military leaders. So, in general, the Sahel right now is conceived as one of the most unstable and most democratically backsliding areas of the whole of Africa. Since 2020, there have been close to around 7 to 8 coups or attempted coups in the region. Um, some countries, 4 countries actually had successful military coups: Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. I would also remind you guys of all the motions that we have been doing. Like I'm assuming you guys have seen some as well about ECOWAS, about the African Union, how they respond to these coups, how they respond to this democratic backsliding. So it's kind of important to think about these movements in motions like those as well. Um, the big cause of these movements are primarily to address economic stagnation that has been taking place in the Sahel. So this looks like famine. This looks like slowing economic growth. This looks like welfare systems becoming more constrained. But it also looks like increasing insecurity and the narrative that these democratic governments are not suitable or nor do they, and the fact that they don't have the capacity to maintain security in light of this increasing terrorism, increasing militarization, increasing military juntas and what's the word? Uh, Paramilitary groups that are rising in the region. And the response to this has been military coups, where the military has taken control of the state apparatus, taken control of the legislation and the executive, and centralized their power around themselves, and have said that this is the way we protect ourselves. This is the way where we ensure economic growth, economic stability, and the protection of the state system. In majority of these countries, in the short term at least, there has been mass popularity around these military coups. So there has been societal support. Obviously, this societal support is informal because while some of these military juntas have promised elections, they have not done those. So it is very difficult to gauge whether there is actually democratic support for these groups or whether it's very surface level democratic support to say that we support this because they are better than the option that was there. Nor do we know whether there are people on the ground are scared, and as a result, because of their fear, they are very supportive on the surface level because they don't want to be attacked and they don't want to be repressed. So this is kind of the context in which these military coups are actually happening. Another big important characteristic of the Sahel right now is a withdrawal of the French and the US military engagement and a move towards Russia. The reason why this is important is majority of the countries in the Sahel were colonized by France. And French colonial imposition is still a big characteristic of this region. So many of these countries have French military troops actively stationed. They have French companies doing things like mining, doing things like oil excavations, doing things like gold retrievals, etc. So it's a big neo-colonial imposition that is still going on in these countries. And obviously, the US military also plays an important role in the picture in these countries. However, these military coups have been pushing away from this French and US imposition and have been actively kicking out the French military, for example. So the picture here is of Ibrahim Traore, who is the military leader of Burkina Faso. He banned French companies. He kicked out the French military and nationalized the mining and the mineral industry of Burkina Faso. So he's kind of like portrays himself as a staunch decolonial leader who is a pan-African, who is an African nationalist, etc. So he kind of buys into those narratives about African culture, African independence, and is putting himself in light in opposition to Western colonialism. However, obviously, this is kind of like a cognitive dissonance because a lot of these countries, like for example, Mali, moved away from French military towards the Wagner Group and towards the Russian military. So it's kind of a cognitive dissonance of like obviously these countries need Western military support because their local military, even though it is strong, does not have the infrastructure, nor do they have the weaponry, the capacity to actually fight alone the paramilitary groups, the terrorist groups in these countries. So it's kind of a interesting that the dichotomy of like push away the French, push away the US, bring the Russians, bring the Wagner military, bring the Russian, sometimes even the Chinese military to get support. The reason why I want to talk about this case as well is obviously this is in a way a backsliding of democracy. So even though there are social movements, this is actively anti-democratic. More military centralization of power, where there is more repression, there is more military violence, there is more military control, and an erosion of legislature, erosion of the democratic systems of voting, elections, civil society, etc. Another really important factor in the Sahel is rising terrorism. So this looks like fundamentalist Islamic terrorists rising and using these countries as staging points for their terrorism in other countries like Nigeria, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, etc., and using the instability that these coups have created to get different pockets of power in different provinces and using them as staging areas for mass violence elsewhere. And obviously, this also erodes democracy because when you have Muslim Islamic fundamentalism, obviously democracy erodes because there's erosion of democracy, erosion of like women's rights, erosion of voting, and a centralization of more violence and a more autocratic, more repressive system. So this is kind of a different type of social movement that is also happening in the developing world, primarily in the Sahel. So also includes countries like Sudan, includes countries like Ethiopia, where there has been genocide of like Eritrea, things like that. So that's a different kind of way to conceptualize the developing world. Maybe there is backsliding happening in these countries. Okay, so that's the last slide I have. Obviously, then I'm now open to any questions. Obviously, you can ask any questions not related to anything specific we discussed here, or in general, just democracy or social movements in the developing world. But yeah, that's it from me. Yeah, thank you for having me, guys. But I'll be around for like next 3 4 minutes to answer any questions. But yeah.
I have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So a few slides ago, you mentioned that in social movement debates, you break it down in a few questions. I was wondering if you could repeat those questions.
Yeah. So the first question is what the social movement actually looks like, and I kind of break it down into who the different actors within the social movement is. So for example, if it's a more debate, I break it down to maybe more white feminists, maybe like more intersectional feminists, like feminists who are from the developing world, etc. Like any social movement debate. The second part, and then this, I also ask myself questions about who leads these social movements, whether it's centralized, decentralized, etc. The second question I ask myself is what tactics are available for the social movement to carry out and achieve its goals. This helps me answer questions of like how much capital does the social movement have, Should they do their messaging? How much should it be streamlined? Should it be diverted? Should it be diverse, etc.? So kind of what are the tactics that the social movement should do? What are the trade-offs that happen when you do those tactics? And what do those tactics actually look like? The third question I ask myself is, what is the response to this social movement? So this looks like, how does society relate, or how do they interact with the social movement? How do the moderates react to the social movement? How do extreme people react to the social movement? How do conservatives react to the social movement? How do corporations react to the social movement? How do governments react to the social movement? How does the international community react to the social movement? And that helps me kind of answer, what is the best strategy that is available? How do I target my strategies to get the most success? How do I get funding? How do I need to moderate the social movement, etc.? So it is, what does the social movement look like? Break it down into different groups. Or what are the tactics available to the social movement? And thirdly, what is the societal response to the social movement? And then I look at different societal groups and how they respond to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How would you weigh up in a debate, sort of, I guess this works for sort of both sides often with depending on the motion. How would you weigh up this idea of the likelihood of the success of the movement? So sort of how do you weigh up the risk of, I know you talked about it a bit as one of the questions that you kind of ask as part of that, what is the response to it? But
Yeah.
how would you sort of somewhat structurally, emphasize that it would be successful or unsuccessful?
Yeah. So I think my approach usually here, when I ask myself this question, is first to recognize social movements aren't zero sum. They might not achieve their biggest goal. So, for example, let's say for a feminist movement, the you don't achieve the most, like, greatest amount of like repatriation or like equality in society, but you can achieve some things. So I would first kind of like hedge my bet and kind of explain that social movements have multiple different goals, and achieving any of them is somewhat of a success, and not like be like the debate world problem of like, oh, if I don't achieve this, it's a failure. They don't prove anything if they don't prove the biggest impact. That's just not how social movements work. They aren't zero sum. They have multiple different smaller, softer goals that they can achieve. And that makes it much easier for the team that is trying to argue for prove their case, right? Because you aren't trying to prove the most extreme thing. That's the first thing I try to do. Explain that social movements aren't zero sum. They have multiple different goals. They also have very median, short term, softer goals that are also important and also do matter. The second thing I would ask myself is, what factors need to be fulfilled in order to in order for a goal to be achieved. So, for example, let's say political change, right? Like, let's say, for example, let's say talk about the case of like Bangladesh and its political change. There are multiple different variable factors that need to be answered, right? One would be the fact that you need to dispose of the current government. Two, you need to bring in a new government with a majority that can actually pass votes. Three, they have to create stability and peace within the country to actually pass those laws. And then I go on to explain as to how you can meet most of those variables. All of those variables as well, I might not be able to achieve for the fullest. So, in the last question, there might be pockets of instability for the next 5 years. But that doesn't mean that you can't, in certain areas, pass certain policies. You can't pass a constitution. You can't pass a budget. So, even within those different variables, you need to kind of recognize that it's a spectrum. And even achieving some things in the spectrum is a valid goal and is a legitimate thing that is valuable for the social movement. Um, and that's kind of like what I would try to achieve. The final thing I would say is that I think there is goals for the social movement that aren't contingent on societal change. There are internal goals for the social movement itself. That is to say that the social movement might have a goal of bringing together different groups of people. It might have a goal of like bringing together conservatives into the social movement. It might have a goal of increasing its membership. It might have a goal of meeting a funding goal. And so these are less contingent on how the society reacts to it, and are much lower burden impacts that you can achieve. So I would focus on also kind of flowering a few of these in, so then closing teams can't come and say, but they don't meet the tipping point of social change. You're like, okay, maybe we didn't, but we have the more internal goals that we actually do meet because it is not contingent on societal reactions or societal change, but rather contingent on how we like internally do certain things or internally coalesce or internally interact with different groups. So that's kind of like three different approaches you would kind of want to think about when you're thinking about the question of success. Does that make sense?
Very clear. Thank you very much.
Okay, any other questions? I think we should have time for like two more if there is, but otherwise we can wrap up. You can just also put it in the chat if that like is harder or it's easier. I think we're good, Peter, then. Yeah, it looks like there's no other questions.
Yeah, I think everyone has